Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the Knowledge Exchange workshop on restoring estuaries for salmon. Those who have been watching our slideshow during the break, we hope you've enjoyed seeing some of the examples of estuary restoration projects that members of our virtual audience have submitted. The slideshow is intended to foster collaborations and networking opportunities across our virtual community, and we've received really diverse and interesting projects. So thanks to everyone who took the time to submit a slide, and the deck will be available on the PSF website after the workshop if you want to reach out and make connections with any of the project leads that are identified in those slides. So now I'll tee up Greer again, and Greer, I'll pass the mic over to you to introduce our first speaker of the afternoon and someone that I know you've worked with closely over the years.
Thank you, Jason. Yes, I'm pleased to introduce a longtime colleague, Catherine Corbett, who's the chief scientist with the Lower Columbia Estuary Partnership. Catherine joined the partnership in 2008 and leads its science team, managing the habitat restoration, data management, and monitoring programs. Catherine's work led to developing a strategic prioritization plan and effectiveness monitoring program for the Lower Columbia River Estuary, which we'll hear a bit about today, and which has improved regional investments in restoration across the estuary. She also led the effort to establish voluntary numeric habitat coverage targets for the Lower Columbia River. Catherine coordinates monitoring and restoration activities with numerous partners in the Lower Columbia River. And prior to joining the partnership in 2008, Catherine gained work and research experience in a wide variety of places, from Massachusetts to Florida and even the Middle Atlas Mountains of Morocco. And with that, I'll pass it off to you, Catherine.
Thank you, Greer. Yeah, everybody knows the Middle Atlas Mountains of Morocco is like the bed of estuarine research and restoration. So appreciate that. I want to express my thanks to the workshop organizers, Greer and Laura, for the opportunity to present our work in the Lower Columbia River and Estuary. Personally, I hope to learn from others different methods for approaching conservation in a shifting climate. For this conversation, I was asked to focus on a restoration prioritization framework. Spoiler alert, we use traditional conservation biology approaches to develop this framework, and we all know that our traditional conservation biology methods will not be sufficient in a changing climate. So then I will also focus on what efforts we're trying so as to weave climate adaptation and mitigation throughout our conservation programming and within individual restoration projects, so that we are managing for change, not only persistence. I'd love to hear from others, either at today's workshop or if there's interest in a future conversation, additional ideas and suggestions so that we can continue to grow in our approach with climate resiliency. Yeah. Perfect. This is a graph. Whoops, I skipped that one. This is a graphic of the Lower Columbia River from Bonneville Dam down here down to the mouth. The Columbia is a large drowned river estuary with a small area of salinity in this area, and a large freshwater tidal section that goes all the way up to Bonneville Dam. If you divide the river into 3 sections, each section has vastly different personalities. In the lowest section of the river, the upper section is only backwatered or inundated during high rainfall events in the winter, and then with snowmelt that marks the spring freshet. The middle section is somewhere in between, depending on where the wetland sits. The upper section up here is the lower section of the Columbia River Gorge, an area with high elevation gradient and a very narrow floodplain. Historically, there was not a lot of floodplain habitat, and now with the transportation corridor that runs east-west through this area, the habitat is even more fragmented and rare. And then the middle section of the river from like Portland down to Longview is highly urbanized and industrial, and includes a fair amount of simplified habitat and hardened shorelines. These different regional personalities, if you will, are very important when designing restoration projects focused on reconnecting floodplain habitats historically used by outmigrating juvenile salmon and steelhead. Transitioning into how we created habitat coverage targets. So when I first started at the Estuary Partnership, we were using practical habitat restoration targets like basically 15,000 acres by 2015, 25,000 acres by 2025. And these were basically based on like what we thought we could accomplish by that time frame. They were not ecologically based and not terribly satisfying for protecting and recovering endangered species and or like retaining biological integrity. So I ended up starting to work on this based on a lot of work that had happened that I was familiar with in Florida at a national estuary program down there. And I should stop and say that the Lower Columbia Estuary Partnership is a national estuary program, and we are an ecosystem management-based program. The idea is to get everybody together to talk about and come up with habitat restoration targets and different things that we're going to do to restore and protect that estuary of national significance. So I should say there are only 3 overarching methods for creating resource-based habitat coverage target for a conservation network. And it depends on how you lump or split, but Reed-Noss is probably a little bit more of a lumper, but there's only really 3 overarching methods for doing this. The first is to protect biodiversity hotspots or areas important for a large number of endemic species or species not found elsewhere. In the case of the Lower Columbia, a large effort to protect areas for the Pacific Flyway or other areas for national wildlife refuges occurred many decades ago. Another frequently used approach is to identify focal species and then their habitat approach. The third approach that is frequently used to protect and restore underrepresented, I'm having some issues with my computer, I apologize. Underrepresented habitats. I am loving this. Okay, there we go. The third approach that is frequently used is to protect and restore underrepresented habitats, those that have been lost to human disturbance. The objective here is to ensure representation of that historic habitat template or mosaic. These 3 approaches can and often do point to different locations and habitats for protection and restoration in a conservation network. Getting back to the focal species approach, for almost 2 decades, we've been using what we call a stepping stone approach to identify priority habitats for improving the survival and condition of juvenile salmon and steelhead as they out-migrate through the Lower River. Hood et al. In 2021 recently documented this approach and put more specificity to this framework. The goal for the approach is to ensure floodplain habitats for refuge and feeding throughout their migratory pathway from Bonneville Dam down to the mouth. In addition, specificity is to make sure that there's a maximum travel distance of no more than 5 kilometers in between these refuge sites. There's a higher rate of mortality if it ends up being longer distances in between these different refuge sites. So in addition to providing these stepping stones, refuge sites along the migratory pathway, the work also recommends increasing the size and accessibility of refuge locations and improving the complexity of other habitat along that migratory route. This approach gets to the where and what questions of a conservation network, specifically targeting a focal species of salmon and steelhead. If we get back to the overarching, get back to that historical habitat mosaic, native species evolved over the millennia with historic conditions, and restoring to these conditions should be protected from native species, including salmon and steelhead. So a lot of the habitats that we're focused on are those floodplain habitats that salmon and steelhead historically used. The other idea is that historic or diversity of habitats. By providing that throughout the migratory pathway, you will also be providing or supporting a diversity of life history strategies for salmon and steelhead. So that what we ended up doing is we mapped out, we digitized the general land office survey notes from the 1870s or so, and we also produced a 2009 land cover data set from satellite data and aerial photography. We then created a crosswalk of habitat classifications between these 2 data sets, and finally we compared habitat coverage in the historic data set to present day land cover. So through this comparison, we found that the Lower Columbia lost about 50% of its historic native habitat through conversion to urban, industrial, and agricultural development. Some habitats were hit worse than others, and we wanted to prioritize the recovery of those habitats that are now most underrepresented in order to recover that historic template. So this is a graph that is showing a comparison of historic habitat coverage in gray versus present day coverage in black for one of our 8 river reaches. We identified those habitats that we lost the most of, circled in red here, and prioritized those types of habitats for protection and recovery. Habitats that were historically rare and are still rare today were also prioritized for protection and recovery. The result is this list of prioritized habitats by each of the 8 river reaches. This gets to the where and when and what, sorry, not when, where and what questions of which habitats we want to protect and recover. The next question we wanted to answer is how much is enough? So once again, when working on this, there was a finite suite of methods for establishing measurable targets for habitat coverage, the how much is enough. The single species population goal method uses a minimum viable population or population viability analysis, and then the habitat requirements needed to sustain these goals. The multiple species method is essentially the same, except you use a keystone species or a focal species, and you first identify those, and then you for folks, but that ends up being a lot of resources. And
If you can see it on your end, but your screen's freezing on us every 4 or 5 minutes. So it looks like it's connecting. So we'll just kind
Okay.
of we'll hold those pauses, but if it goes more than 20 or 30 seconds or so, Laura and I will jump in and fill in the blank while your system reconnects. But
Okay.
yeah, it's happening kind of semi-regular. So if you look at us and we look weird or we're talking and you wonder why, that's what we're doing on our end in the
I
studio.
keep getting like it's unstable, and I thought maybe if my camera is off, maybe it might get a little bit better. What do you think?
You're welcome to try that. Yeah. Yeah, I think
Okay.
that the
Sometimes
tech.
that works.
Okay, why don't you give that a
Okay.
go?
Okay. Cause there it did. Froze again. Is it working?
We can hear you. Yeah, your screen looks frozen, but we can hear you.
Okay. Okay. We ended up using, instead of a single species or multiple species, we ended up using an ecosystem-based approach. Um, This is the last method. It's easier. It basically is a recovery of a percentage of historic habitat coverage that will be protective of species using those habitats. This approach has been widely used in a lot of conservation programs. For example, in Tampa Bay, Florida, they targeted a 1950s habitat coverage, the 1950s being a time before widespread air conditioning was available and therefore large-scale urbanization occurred. And so Teradol does a great job of describing how various conservation programs have approached the question of quantifiable targets for conservation network, the trade-offs with the various approaches, and ultimately they provide recommendations for how to do this. They cite that some programs recommend a 10 to 12% of habitat coverage across a large geographic area, such as a national scale. Whereas other research recommends a minimum of 30% of habitat coverage, and this is based on species area curves established in MacArthur and Wilson in 1967 as a basis for that 30% target. The Nature Conservancy, what did I just do? Okay, the Nature Conservancy recommends this 30% target across the set geography. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service explored this target for national wildlife refuges. The Biden administration, the previous administration, used the 30% national target in their policies focused on reducing the. So, and we ended up using this number for a number for our targets. And then Teradol also recommends other considerations, including short-term and longer-term targets, and including what they call the 3 Rs: representation of habitats, redundancy in that representation, and resiliency. So using that 30% goal in our short-term target, well, this is a result. Our habitat coverage targets are over here. So, the first target is no net loss of native habitats as of that 2009 baseline. This represents a 50% loss of historic coverage. We don't want to lose any more. Then recovering 30% of historic coverage of priority habitats by 2030, and then 40% of those priority habitats by 2050. The 2050 goal equates to a restoration target of restoring 22,480 acres of priority habitats, in addition to the no net loss of any native habitat. If we can meet these targets, the end result would be about 60% of historic native habitat coverage and a representation of the historic habitat mosaic. It is important to note that the overarching goal for these targets is to protect common species from becoming impaired. Additional approaches, specifically the focal and single species approaches described earlier, to ensure their habitat needs are met. This is the generalized species area curve as adapted by Dobson in 1996. In the interest of time, I won't discuss this now, but feel free to contact me later if interested in learning more, or read Dobson 1996. I highly recommend it. So to understand how we are doing in implementing a proposed conservation network, we then track our progress through a geodatabase. We reach out to all of our partners annually to learn about restoration projects they are working on. We upload the information into our restoration inventory. We can then map out the information and overlay with the habitat coverage targets to compare and learn how we are doing in meeting our targets and where we need to focus our next steps. So getting back to this map that I keep showing, this is basically a map that describes the status of habitats in the lower river. We've mapped out all the areas that are intact native habitats in green. So you can see that like right here, there's a fair bit. We mapped out areas that are largely impervious surface, like here and here, as recovery challenged areas. These represent the urban and industrial areas and are very likely expensive and challenging to restore to native habitats. So we're calling them recovery challenged. The dark pink areas are those areas in low intensive agriculture or managed for historical importance, recreation, or other land uses not specific to protecting fish and wildlife. These are mapped as recoverable with the objective of ultimately collaborating with landowners to restore these to native habitats or manage them using regenerative practices as opportunities for supporting fish and wildlife and other ecosystem services in addition to agriculture. So that's our prioritization framework in a nutshell. However, our habitat coverage targets, again, use traditional conservation biology approaches that focus on the recovery of the historic habitat template and manage for a suite of species within a confined geography when we know major changes with a shifting climate are already occurring and that these traditional methods are insufficient in protecting fish and wildlife species. So then we started looking for other ways of like adding climate adaptation or climate smart practices into our work. Protecting biodiversity and species will require a shift from classic place-based strategies that maintain the integrity of local reserves within fixed boundaries to more dynamic strategies that foster the ability of species to move across landscapes so they can persist. Managing for change, not only persistence and forward-thinking goals are critical aspects to include into our conservation programs, and Stein et al. Is a great resource this climate adaptation framework, Schmitz et al. In 2015. This one provided several guidelines, and then we adapted this by adding the last guideline based on our needs after some conversations with a couple authors. So things that we're already doing: protecting current patterns of biodiversity, protect large intact natural landscapes and ecological processes, and maintain and establish ecological connectivity, or all aspects of traditional conservation practices. The last one is where we start to fold in forward-thinking goals, providing connectivity and corridors, not only to conserve and promote species and genetic diversity, but also to create permeability for species movement and range shifts so that species can move to meet their new climate niche. Other new steps are to evaluate landscape permeability for whether species can move to their climate niche or if other lands are needed. Next is to identify and protect areas providing future climate space or refugia for species being displaced by climate change, and identify if these areas are managed to protect these species or ecological conditions. And finally, importantly, identify when in a target species life history they are vulnerable to climate change and identify management actions to address those vulnerabilities. So we've mapped out cold water refuges in the lower river and are working towards enhancing and improving those to make sure that we have that ability to target where salmon and steelhead are vulnerable to warming water temperatures, for instance. So some example of climate adaptation measures we've been working on include we mapped sea level rise and the vulnerability of our floodplain habitats and our targets being able to be met because of coastal squeeze. We started working on with the lower Columbia communities to develop projects that would develop setback levees or elevate infrastructure or incentivize retreating from low-lying coastal areas in response to increasing flooding with sea level rise and more intense and frequent storms. We've been designing bridges and culverts to withstand bigger and flashier flows. We're working on identifying and protecting and enhancing cold water refuges and hyporheic exchange in response to warming temperatures, focusing on process-based restoration techniques such as valley bottom reconnection, and then favoring or integrating drought-tolerant plant species in plant establishment projects in response to decreasing precipitation and longer, drier summers. And, we should all be thinking about this and including climate adaptation measures in our restoration engineering designs. And I would love to hear what other folks are doing in addition to these pretty standard guidelines or actions. This is an overview of what we did at our Staggerwald floodplain reconnection project recently. We reconnected about 1,000 acres of on the main stem Columbia by building 2 setback levees, removing 2.2 miles of existing levee, and removing internal water control infrastructure. The project was focused on the recovery of salmon, steelhead, and lamprey habitat and restoring passage to Gibbons Creek, a perennial stream that runs from the Columbia River Gorge and flows through Staggerwald National Wildlife Refuge. Instead of the 100-year flood event as an engineering design standard that is traditionally used, we ended up using a 500-year flood event in anticipation of higher and more flashier river flows. The new setback levees have wind wave overbuild and living shoreline instead of a traditional riprap for wind wave protection. And probably the coolest thing we did is we restored a historic alluvial fan to provide habitat complexity and thermal cooling. Some considerations for explicitly adding climate mitigation or the reduction of greenhouse gases into our conservation programs, because protecting and restoring natural lands is critical. Up to 1/3 of emission reductions needed to meet the Paris Agreement by 2030 could be obtained by protecting intact forests, tidal wetlands, and recovering and reforesting lost or degraded habitats. Conversely, the loss or conversion to impervious surface, draining, etc., of native habitats emits greenhouse gases. So this should be consideration for compensatory mitigation and environmental regulations here in the US. In addition, resource agencies could include this within funding priorities and scoring rubric for projects. And we are working on steps to keep track of land conversions and inventory greenhouse gas sequestration and emissions by the habitats specific to the lower Columbia River at multiple levels across the estuarine tidal freshwater gradient throughout the lower river, and then within an individual site, upslope across mudflats, emergent marsh, shrub, scrub, and forested. So this brings us to one of my last slides, which is our work on researching carbon methane flux. Historically, a lot of focus on natural climate solutions for sequestering greenhouse gas emissions has been focused on protecting forests or planting trees at a large scale. The amount and rate of sequestration in forests and various types of trees is pretty well understood. Blue carbon, or the ability of coastal habitats such as seagrass beds and tidal marshes to sequester carbon, is becoming better understood, but is still in its infancy. And then research has shown coastal habitats can exceed the amount of terrestrial forests for sequestering greenhouse gases. However, the types of restoration we focus on in the lower Columbia entirely influence freshwater wetland habitats, even less is known. So this knowledge gap prohibits the use of our types of projects within the carbon market, and it keeps funders from prioritizing our projects for their potential role as natural climate solutions. So it's critical that we fill this knowledge gap, especially if we ever want to use the carbon market as a funding source. 'Cause we're always looking for additional funding sources for restoration and protection actions, as you know. Or if funding or resource management agencies want to include a rubric for climate mitigation within their grant programs or how they evaluate and prioritize projects. So with partners at Oregon Health and Science University, Portland State University, the Columbia River Intertribal Fish Commission, and the Cowlitz Indian Tribe, we deployed 2 eddy covariance flex towers and soil chambers to measure greenhouse gas fluxes at both the individual site scale and within the site at individual habitats. We have these at 2 sites now, and we're rotating these around to different sites across the river that represent different types of environmental conditions and restoration techniques. And so we completed the method testing phase, and we are now moving on to the rotation. We are collaborating with the Pacific Northwest Blue Carbon Working Group on expanding the regional carbon calculators with the hopes that we can address uncertainties related to the types of projects and the role of lower river habitats might have in climate mitigation. This is the very last slide. And our next steps is to consider this and integrate this into our conservation program. We are also updating our land cover data set so we can track locations and how much habitat we've lost and recovered since we last completed our last data set in 2009. To track habitat conversions and the potential for emissions associated with these conversions. And the last bullet is really additional thought for consideration about using working lands for multiple purpose. A thought is to expand natural resource management activities to include working lands or include working lands under the conservation program umbrella. One approach could be through the application of regenerative practices that focus on soil health. These also sequester carbon, retain soil, cycle nutrients, and reduce chemical contaminants. These practices can often increase habitat for species on working lands, allow corridors, and increase the permeability of working lands to allow migration and range expansion of different species. We usually consider or manage working lands separately from resource conservation programs and might be missing this important opportunity. And with that, I'd like to thank the many people who contributed to the various approaches within this presentation.
All right, thank you for that, Catherine, and thanks for bearing with us on some of those technology hiccups.
Sorry about that.
Oh no, don't worry. I think those gremlins get all of us. There's a few questions in the Slido. I just wanted to ask one to open. I apologize if you covered this, but can you give us a ballpark of the dollar cost for what's been done and what you still hope to do in an approximate timeline? Like, I'm just looking for a ballpark. Is this $2 million a year for 5 years, or what kind of frame is this work being done under?
Well, okay, so the Steigerwald project alone, which was reconnected about 1,000 acres, that was around a $32 million price tag. And that was, it took about 10 years to construct, or I'm sorry, 10 years to design and permit, and then it was like 2 or 3 years for construction. And it was altogether about $32 million. We have another project right now that we're working on the East Fork Lewis River that's $20 million. So it's a lot of money. It's a pretty urbanized area. And so I want to say Bonneville Power Administration, which funds a fair bit of this work, their budget is approximately it's approximately about 15 million, and that includes not just the work that we do, but our partners at the Cowlitz Indian Tribe, the Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife, Columbia River Estuary Study Task Force, and Columbia Land Trust. It's probably about 15 million a year, and that does not include what the states are contributing and other federal agencies like the NOAA Habitat Restoration Program. So it's a fair amount.
So it's just, again, just so I get my head around this, it's more than $10 million a year on an ongoing basis.
Pretty much, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm not trying to pin you down. I'm just trying to, like what you're showing from a British Columbia perspective, looks quite impressive. It looks like something that will be wonderful to follow, but what's the fiscal reality that you need to have in place in order to advance that?
I want to just say the prioritization framework that we created was not we ended up doing that. We were lucky in that we had the ability to digitize the old General Land Office survey notes and then also do a land cover data set so that we could do that comparison. Because that is really, really key to coming up with how much habitat you've lost and what you need going forward. And using that current land cover as a way of saying, okay, well, here's where your impervious surfaces are, so this might not be the practical areas, but here's some other opportunity locations with low intensive land use kind of thing. So it's not a huge, as long as you have this, at least a couple of data sets, it's not a lot. I say that, it's not terribly expensive to do. Minimum viable population and population viability analysis, on the other hand, are probably that was without outside of our resources.
Okay, I think I can relate to that. I'll turn to our Slido here. One that was near the top, I'll just kind of grab it from the mix here. How are biological factors such as pinnipeds and invasive species factored into the framework?
Invasive species gets to like the quality. We didn't tackle pinnipeds. Invasive species gets into the quality of habitat, and we're not really prescriptive of the quality of habitat in this. This is mostly, we haven't defined what restoration or native habitats looks like. We tried to create some indices that would do that, and it really gets into like manage for what sort of thing. So we haven't really done that too much yet.
Next one on our list is talking about scale. The scale of areas to restore is always a concern. How does your work prioritize and ensure effectiveness?
Well, we have that framework where we are collecting information on who's doing what where. So we know we have a good feel of who's doing what projects, and we can use that. So that's in a restoration inventory or a geodatabase. So we can basically look at that and compare to our habitat coverage targets and see how we're doing. As Greg said, bigger is always better. Having said that, we also want to make sure that there's a lot of habitats throughout that migratory corridor so that salmon coming from the upper watershed can get to the mouth while being able to tuck into different habitats. In some cases, you're just not going to get big scale projects, and smaller scale is going to have to suffice. The Columbia River Gorge being a good example of that. In some of the areas that we have very urbanized from Portland to Longview, you're probably going to end up having a lot of smaller restoration sites. And then in the mouth, there's some areas where you can do some big projects. And there's already existing some really good, nice habitat in the lower river. So hopefully that answered that.
I think so, but I'm interested in pursuing the point that you made around the connectivity and the network. Is there an answer to, if you had the resources to build a 100-hectare project, would you do one 100-hectare project or two 50-hectare projects in strategic places in the target area, or would you do 10-hectare projects to get this network of connectivity, or is there no simple answer to that?
I don't think there's a simple answer to that. And I think that's the single large or several small argument that folks have been arguing in like the 90s. I guess it depends on your species. So if you're looking at salmon and steelhead, it's that stepping stone approach that we're trying to use to make sure that there's a lot of different places, like truck stops, if you will, so that they can successfully make it from Bonneville Dam down to the mouth. It really depends on the species too, but I feel like, larger is better for the most part. But at the same time, and I think we end up trying to do, ecosystem or watershed-based approaches whenever possible. So like we have a series of projects in the East Fork Lewis River where we've just gone from one project to another project to another project to another project. And the idea there is to try to restore as much as possible of that watershed. It's a steelhead stronghold. So that's where we've kind of been focusing. And then also trying to do similar things to like the Staggerwald project. It's a $32 million investment. We've also got another project upstream of that. The idea there is to protect or restore some of the urban areas upstream of that so that when it hits, the water hits or comes down and flows through Staggerwald, it will be better and improved and less flashy and better, less contaminants, that kind of thing. So we are trying to work on these like on these different kind of projects that would basically leverage each other, I guess, basically.